Good morning. I wish I could say that the Wilson Center runs the DC Metro, or maybe that would be bad to say, but that explains why we have delayed the start, and I'm sure the same thing applies to the audience, which is trying to get here. Nonetheless, you hardy souls are in for a big treat. I'm Jane Harman, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and events like this are what we do and why I'm so proud to be here. I was in Israel. I personally was in Israel just a few weeks ago, and none of you will be surprised to hear that Israel and the neighbors are tense about this Iran deal. Israelis, Saudis, Emiratis, Egyptians, they look at this deal and the risks from Iran differently from the way we do. There's a range of opinion, no doubt, and we'll hear some of it today. But as I say, the cliche is, where you sit is where you stand. That is why it is so important to get ground truth, what we call ground truth on issues like this. And that's what today's event is about. Our speakers are the insiders you will want to know on this topic, and they will offer us a range of views on the Iran nuclear deal from the perspective of the region. That should interest, what they say, should interest every voter and every member of the United States Congress, my former employer. Too many people in Congress with opinions about the Iran deal still, in my view, haven't either read it or taken the time to understand the details. The only thing that polls, important polls in the U.S. Are telling us so far is that Americans don't know what to think. CNN and Pew found a majority of Americans oppose the agreement by a small percentage. But the Washington Post, ABC, and YouGov found the opposite. So there's an urgent need, it seems to me, for information and for context. Let me just add as a personal opinion that not only what Congress does, but how it does it affects America's influence around the world. There's no doubt in my mind that others watching us, let's start with the French and the Germans, have pretty serious responses to inflammatory comments like the deal is leading Jews to the oven. I wish our debate was generating more heat, less heat and more light, showing that in our democracy, good faith disagreement can produce stronger policy. I wish. So today we will have possibly good faith disagreement and better information about how all of us should think about this deal, or at least think about how the neighborhood views this deal. Does the neighborhood believe Iran can change its behavior, that it will stop making mischief in Yemen, Syria, or Iraq? Does the neighborhood think that sanctions relief will be spent on business or bombs? And how are the Gulf states thinking about Iran's return, or robust return to the oil market, a market which, as we all know, has not been robust these days, maybe robust on oil, but not robust on prices? We have a stellar panel to speak to these issues, and I want to give another shout out to the fairly new director of our Middle East program, Henri Barkey, who will introduce you to our moderator and panelists. Henri has been at the center for a few months, and he picked a hell of a news cycle to start his job. In fact, he is part of the news cycle. And Henri, were you on Charlie Rose last night? Did that happen? It's not too shabby. And he leads the exceptional programming we're doing on the issue. So he's a talented scholar. We're lucky to have him. Please join me in welcoming Henri Barkey.
Thank you, Jane. It looks like you've already had enough of me, because I've only been here 3 weeks, so you think it's few months already.
It feels like 3 years.
Right. Thank you all for coming, especially in a day where the Washington Metro decided not to cooperate with us. So we hope that Shlomo Brom will be able to join us. I'm sure he will. So I'm not going to talk too much about our speakers. You have their bios, but I'll just introduce them. They all will talk for about 7 to 10 minutes, and then I will ask them each a question, and then we will open it up to the audience. So we will, I was going to say that we're going to go on the lineup or the schedule that was out there, but we'll see how it works. But we'll start with Mr. Muath Wari, then go to Deb, Amos, and then depending if General Brom is here or not, and then to Mr. Fahad Nazer. So Muath Wari is a senior policy analyst at the Center for American Progress, a former analyst, Supreme National Security Council of the United Arab Emirates. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Henri. And thanks to Aaron for inviting me, for the Wilson Center for having the event. I feel like opponents or proponents of the deal, at least we owe a debt of gratitude to the Obama administration for the cottage industry of Iran events and analysis that's sprung up over the last couple of weeks, though that probably makes my job a little harder in terms of being informative or useful. I think, thinking about trying to decipher the UAE's response to the deal, we probably should keep in mind a few things. Number one, this has never been about the nuclear program, right? This has been about a clandestine program revealed by opposition figures in 2003 in a state that, as a matter of policy, deems it okay to undermine legitimate governments, state structures in the region through the use of militant proxies. And so the opposition was always about the state that had this nuclear program, right? And that's important to say because it allows us to understand that the Emiratis are probably looking towards what happens next. I think they trust that the Obama administration secured the best deal it thinks is possible. And I think they'll be interested to see how we ensure compliance and how we ensure that Iran abides by the agreement. But I think for them, the more interesting question is going to be what is the United States, the P5, going to do about Iranian, what they view as Iranian encroachment in the region, that is Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon. You saw Dr. Anwar Gargash, the UAE Minister of Foreign Affairs, write an op-ed for the Financial Times in which he essentially said, okay, fine, we have this deal, we'll have to live with it, but let's test this proposition that Iran intends to normalize its behavior in the region. And he outlined a pretty high bar, I think, in Yemen and Syria. The other point is, and I met with a few people to sort of run through some of the ideas, and I said one of the things I want to talk about is this idea that this is a sectarian. The struggle, this competition between Iran and the GCC, including the UAE, is anchored in these primordial sectarian grievances from 1400 years ago. I think that is a silly characterization of the issue. And I think it is absolutely inaccurate. This is a geopolitical competition about security. Sectarianism is exacerbated by it and exacerbates it. But it's very dangerous that we buy into this narrative because essentially if you have people fighting over events that took place 1400 years ago, then they're not very rational. And irrational people do not resolve differences diplomatically, right? This is about security. This is about the region, a region riven with conflict. And so if we want to use this deal as a platform to de-escalate tensions and hostilities, we need to keep in mind that the question here is about regional security. The final 2 points I want to make is this. One, we need to also be mindful of the history here, right? In the early 90s, particularly the role of external factors, including the United States. In the early 90s, the US pursued a policy called dual containment in the Middle East. And that policy was not particularly viewed, it didn't generate a lot of support among the Gulf states. They went with it because America was their primary ally, but I think after the Kuwait invasion, they looked at Iraq as the more important or more threatening actor in the region. But ultimately, the US was their major ally, and so they essentially went with the policy. That contributed. I don't think it's the only reason, but it certainly contributed to the hostility developing between the Gulf states and Iran. There were instances in which a rapprochement was possible. There were these fleeting moments of potential with the death of Khomeini, the election of Rafsanjani, King Abdullah going to Iran. Sorry, Fahad, maybe I'm
No, please.
overstepping. But dual containment was the order of the day, and it contributed to this. The second thing is, in 2003, the invasion of Iraq removed the single most important strategic check on Iranian encroachment in the region. I'm not about to relitigate the Iraq war, but I think it's important to be mindful that a momentous American policy in the Gulf region sometimes has unanticipated and long-lasting consequences, and this deal is not going to be any different. Karim Sajipur, my friend, says to me all the time, those who know don't predict, and those who predict don't know. And I think we probably should keep that in mind when we think about the deal. Now, for the US, it has a set of tools that it can deploy to ensure that some of these consequences are mitigated. That is, we get to a point where we can de-escalate. In May, President Obama invited the Gulf leaders to a summit at Camp David. The annex of that agreement, if you read it carefully, reads as a formalized check on Iranian hegemony encroachment in the region. And I think if we want to see a potential future in which these hostilities are de-escalated, then I think we need to see an actioning of the Camp David agreement. That would give the US's allies, the UAE included, the security, the firm ground to stand upon to then test this de-escalatory proposition. And it would also tell Iran that these proxy wars are not winnable, and so it can sue for peace. So I don't know. People ask me, are you for the deal or against the deal? What is the response in the UAE? And I think for them, and I believe it too, it's never really about the deal. It's about what happens next. And I expect that the Emiratis are going to look at, the King Salman coming here in, I think it's in September, and what the US does with regards to the Camp David commitments before they decide to put in a strategy in terms of dealing with the consequences of that deal. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Deborah, Amos, a veteran correspondent from NPR, who's been to the region probably more times than most people. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Henri. Thank you for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here. For me, of course, this is the city that is not familiar. I am in the region more than I am here, and I'm just back from Doha, Riyadh, and all of the border cities in southern Turkey. And there, of course, the agreement is irrelevant to daily life. For Syrians, what they are worried about is being attacked by barrel bombs or chlorine gas from regime helicopters. And that has nothing to do with the Iran deal. But when you're there, there's always a sense that this is where the agreement will be tested. This on-the-ground, real-life stuff is the next step in this agreement. And I think we're going to have a theme here. The Gulf states point out that nothing in the agreement addressed what's happening in the region. There was enormous diplomatic bandwidth that was taken up with getting to this agreement, and they want to know if there's going to be the same amount of attention paid after the agreement is done. I think the Gulf states have come to terms with this. They had 7 extra months to think about it. You could see the reactions on the day that it was announced. There was some difference in the Gulf. Oman, of course, was part of the negotiations right from the start. The UAE benefits by trade, and it's a historic partner with Iran. And even the Saudis, by last Thursday, publicly said, if it gets rid of a nuclear weapon, then we are for it. But it's not the nuclear deal that the Gulf is worried about. So let's not pay attention to the details, because that's not where the devil is. The devil is in what's next, and a recognition that there's been a calculus of power that's shifted. You can feel it in Washington. Every Iranian professor who can get a visa has come to visit. The power elite are taking Persian cooking classes. Washington has turned, and people feel it. And that is reflected in Gulf reactions. They see, what we all see, is China's doubled their investment in Iran. Shell and Peugeot are in talks. The Europeans are sending trade delegations. Apple is already talking to the Iranians, and for the first time, a population that has more than one phone, most of them smart, will be buying them legally in the next couple of years. It's a market that is irresistible. It is the last major market of consumers in the world that is untapped, so that is hard to ignore. But I think for the region, what is also hard to ignore is the region is now on fire. And people are living this in their daily lives, even if they are not touched specifically in these conflict zones. So I hope today that what the takeaway message is what's next. And that, I think, is the most important message I can take back from the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Shlomo, you came in, but we'll put you on the hot seat immediately. Shlomo Brom, who's also at CAP and was a former general in the Israeli army. Thank you.
Thank you, Henri. Well, I can start by reacting to some extent to what the previous speakers said, those that I listened to and those that I didn't listen to, because I know how, I believe how Gulfies are thinking. There is a lot of talk recently about the joint interest of Israel and the Gulf states and the possibilities of cooperation between them. And there is some grain of truth in it, because the two of them are in conflict with Iran and looks at Iran as the main threat. But here it starts and here it ends, because it was said here, it is not about the deal. In the case of Israel, it is about the deal. Right. For Israel, the most important issue is Iran's nuclear program and the possibility that Iran will become a nuclear power. There was much debate during the last, I would say, more than 20 years that I recall, about what is the right approach for dealing with this issue. Diplomatic approach, I mean, not the other alternative, whether it is military operations, etc. And there was always a debate between the so-called grand deal and the nuclear deal. There were times that those that were engaged in this subject believed that the best approach is to have a grand deal, to have negotiations with Iran in which all the issues will put on the table. And there will be a deal on all the issues. I think that in recent years it became very clear that a grand deal is not possible because of the strong contradiction between Iran's interests and the United States' interests. And because of that, the negotiations were only about Iran's nuclear program. And so all the arguments that are outside Iran's nuclear program, I think, are excuses. Now, why it is for Israel the main issue? It is for Israel the main issue because it was the centerpiece of Prime Minister Netanyahu security and foreign policy. That was the agenda with which he went to the recent elections. And he believes that he won the elections because of his security agenda, not because of other subjects. So from his point of view, it also brings a lot of political dividends, which is, of course, very important to any politician. But it's not only a matter of political calculations. he really believes that Iran is an existential threat. He believes that the combination of a regime which is a religious regime, an ideological regime, and nuclear weapons is very dangerous because they can act irrationally. Once they will get the bomb, they will use the first opportunity to drop it on Israel. And when you think that something is an existential threat, you are extremely focused on this subject, not on other subjects. It's not that Iran is not a problem for Israel in other areas. It's about Hezbollah, Hamas, and other troublemakers. It's a problem, but it's not the main issue for Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying very hard recently to create the perception that all Israelis are united against this deal, against this agreement, which is, in my opinion, a little bit problematic in a vibrant democracy like Israel. What is exactly all Israelis are united against the agreement? It is like saying all Americans are united against something. There is no subject on which all Americans are united or all Israelis are united. And indeed, recently, there are dissenting voices. And for the sake of transparency, I am one of these dissenting voices. The dissenting voices are coming mainly from the Israeli security and foreign policy community. Not from the politicians, because all the Israeli mainstream politicians concluded from what happened in recent elections that the worst thing for them is to be perceived soft on security. So all of them are tough on security. But the dissenting voices, like my voice, believe that it's not a perfect agreement. It has a lot of weaknesses, but it is better than the alternatives. And we don't believe that a better agreement was really possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Shlomo. Our next speaker is Mr. Fahad Nazer. He's a political analyst with JTG Incorporated. He's a former analyst at the Embassy of Saudi Arabia here in Washington. And you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Henri, and thank you for inviting me here today. It's a real honor to be among such a distinguished company. I think it's very tempting to assume that all Saudis, all 20 million of us, all agree that the Iran deal is a terrible one and it is the end of the world as we know it, and that it will usher in a new era of Iranian hegemony in the region with the blessing of the United States and European powers. I think a slightly more nuanced reading suggests that there are dissenting voices. People have read the agreement differently, and that, especially in light of recent statements by the Saudi Foreign Minister, Adel Jaber, that the Saudi position has shifted slightly, but I think in a significant way, to suggest that maybe the Saudis are no longer committed to trying to prevent the agreement from being implemented. So initially, as Deborah mentioned earlier, within a few hours of the announcement of the deal, the Saudi press agency, which is an official agency of the Saudi government, issued a very innocuous-sounding statement that was, in many ways, very consistent with what the Saudis have been saying for months prior to July 14th, which is that they support any agreement that ensures that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons, and that has enough guarantees in place to ensure that sanctions can be reinstated in case Iran violates the agreement, and also that the agreement is based on a robust inspection and verification regime. Now, since that time, obviously, there's been several high-level meetings between Saudi and American officials. Foreign Minister Al-Jaber was here in Washington a couple of weeks ago, where he met with both Secretary Kerry and President Obama. Secretary Carter was in Saudi Arabia just last week. And it was shortly after that meeting that Foreign Minister Al-Jaber spoke to the media and said that, you know, now that we've had a chance to look at the details of the agreement, and while we continue to be in discussions with the American government in terms of looking at the details of the agreement, that there appears to be enough in this agreement to meet our concerns in terms of, again, a robust inspection and verification regime, and the provisions that provide for snapback sanctions in the case of Iran violating the terms of the agreement. Now, some people might just say that, might conclude that, well, Foreign Minister Al-Jaber is being very diplomatic. He's trying his best to make sure that a real rupture in relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia does not take place. But I'm not sure that that's the case, to be honest. I think it is the notion that Saudi Arabia now does agree with other countries that this is perhaps the best option possible, and that it's as good as it gets for the time being, and that it actually buys them a little bit of time to adjust and to new realities in the region, should not be dismissed outright. I think that if one looks at the foreign ministry of Saudi Arabia over the years, foreign policies of Saudi Arabia, sorry, I think flexibility and pragmatism have actually been hallmarks of their foreign policy, and I think they're adjusting to the new realities in the region. Now, having said that, by no means am I implying here that the Saudis are simply depending on the U.S. and hoping for the best, and they've said, senior Saudi officials have said, we are not going to stand by, and indeed they've taken some concrete measures to, I think, that can be seen as their way of responding to the changes in the region. One of the things that they've done, they have gone on a very intensive diplomatic effort to speak to both regional and global leaders. They've spoken with leaders of Turkey, Pakistan, all the obviously GCC countries, among many others. They've also had meetings, high-level meetings with the leaders of Russia and France. And this is, I think, all with the view that while they certainly still realize and appreciate their strong relationship and partnership with the United States, especially in the area of security, that they are trying to keep their options open. These are very tough times in the region. It's the turbulence is possibly unprecedented, and so they're trying to keep their options open. They're speaking to everybody who will listen to let them know where they stand on Iran and how they see Iran as in the region. Now, there's many Saudis. Having said all that, obviously the prevailing view among Saudis is that Iran constitutes a very serious threat to its security. Some notable, well-known Saudi writers have come outright and said that Iran is a bigger threat to their security than ISIS. Now, in the West, that sounds perhaps a little absurd, but again, I don't think it should be dismissed outright. And I think one of the reasons is that the Iranians have been a threat for decades as far as the Saudis are concerned. With this agreement, the Iranian regime is obviously not going anywhere for quite a while, whereas the threat from ISIS is relatively new. I think Saudis assume that it will not be there for the long term. Now, I'm not sure exactly how you define that. They probably think that they will deal with it over the next 5 years, 10 years from now. I'm not sure about. However, I mean, Saudis have also expressed publicly their concern about the agreement. I think there are 3 notable examples. 2 people that everybody in this room, I'm sure, are very familiar with, who were also former ambassadors to the United States, Prince Bandar bin Sultan and Prince Turki Al Faisal, have both spoken publicly and expressed their concern about Iran's meddling in the region. Prince Turki has spoken about that on many occasions. He's also made it clear, although he's speaking again in his personal capacity, he said that according to his reading, the Saudi government will watch and reserve final judgment on the agreement, but that whatever the P5+1 countries reach with Iran that the Saudis will want the exact same deal, that they will expect to have the same capability. And I think he was referring to uranium enrichment specifically when he was speaking there. I think perhaps even more interesting, a week or so ago, Prince Bandar bin Sultan penned an opinion piece in a Saudi paper where he compared the Iran agreement to the agreement that President Clinton signed with the North Koreans in the early 90s. And Prince Bandar said that it is his belief that President Clinton acted based on the information that was available to him, but he also seems to think that President Obama is simply choosing not to keep in mind the lessons of Korea in mind, and that he thinks that the risks are well worth the rewards in this case. And so that's one thing. And I think it's another thing that I do want to mention is that, and I've written a little about this, and so other Saudis have also expressed the same sentiment, but there does seem to be, I think, a bit of a disconnect in terms of the threat perceptions between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. Regarding Iran specifically. I think many Saudis have argued that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. are looking through threats in the region through different lenses. President Obama gave an interview, I believe it was Jeffrey Goldberg, a month or so ago, in which he said that Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states need to worry less about an external threat from Iran and focus more about possibility of an internal implosion due to a generation of youths who have no hope in the future, or something along those lines. Obviously, that was not received very well in Saudi Arabia, where again, I think the prevailing sentiment is that Iran constitutes a very serious threat to Saudi security. I think if one looks at the hotspots in the region, whether we're talking about Syria, Yemen, Iraq, or even Lebanon, Saudi Arabia and Iran are obviously on polar opposite ends in all of these regions. So ultimately, I think the Saudis feel that Iran's words belie its actions. They, like many on the panel have already mentioned, the Saudis want Iran to follow through. I think there's a serious credibility gap as far as the Saudis are concerned. They're going to watch this very closely. But again, I think they're taking matters into their own hands in many ways, and I think they've done so in dramatic fashion in Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for very interesting comments. Let me start with Muath. You said this is all about what comes next. But do you think that the UAE and the Gulf in general was actually satisfied with the status quo? Would they have preferred if there was no deal, if there were no negotiations, if the containment of Iran that had been imposed had not been all changed? Would that have been better than a deal where what comes next is indeterminate?
Well, I mean, I don't think what comes next was ever really determined, even in the status quo. People forget that Iran, under sanctions over the last couple of years, strict sanctions regime under President Obama, pursued the same policies. It was in Hezbollah in Lebanon, it was in Iraq, it was in Syria, it was in Yemen. And so I think there was a recognition, though, that the nuclear deal is the key issue to the United States and to the P5. And I think what they're looking at now is, I think they always knew that there's more intense interest, and perhaps it's even easier to deal with the nuclear issue than it is to deal with Iran's regional policies. And I think there might have been, over the last couple of years, a recognition that if we deal with the nuclear program question, then we can move to addressing all of these other problems or Iranian policy in the region. But to answer the question, were they satisfied? I don't think they were, because if by satisfied it's just the absence of the deal, which is the factor, right? The absence or presence of the deal. No, I mean, I think they weren't satisfied then, and I think they are probably satisfied after the visits by U.S. officials about the compliance and the restrictions in the program, and I think they actually believe that this deal denies Iran nuclear a nuclear bomb or a nuclear weapon for at least 15 years. No, I don't believe they would have been satisfied had there not been even a deal. I think they'll take what they get in terms of the restrictions.
So you think that they believe that the deal will open up essentially discussion on Iranian regional behavior, which was not in the cards before?
I think they are very interested in having that conversation. I think you have to look at the last 6.5 years in terms of U.S. policy and try to figure out if there is in fact going to be this conversation. I don't think that determination has been made.
Okay, thank you. Deb, you said that Syria was going to be the test case for this new Iran deal. That's how people in the region look at it. So can you unpack that? What does it mean? What do they expect in terms of what would happen? How would Syria become a test case?
Before the Iran deal, many in the region said you can't solve Syria without Iran. And now you begin to hear this in Washington. And this is new, that they will have to have a seat at the table. Syria is a proxy war, 6 wars in one, probably the most complicated of all of the regional conflicts. And it's where you see the head-to-head contest, the regional contest, where Iran lines up with Russia and against the Saudis, the other Gulf states, Turkey, Qatar. Their proxy militias are fighting each other on the ground. And so Syria, I say, is the test because to solve Syria, you probably will need a much grander bargain in the region. Some understanding about security and where overlapping interests lie, who's in charge of what. Because if you don't, you can already see that countries on Syria's borders are beginning to stake out their territory. We're seeing Turkey do it. We're seeing Jordan do it. And so that's why it is the biggest test. It may be the last test. Yemen may be easier somehow than Syria because it is the most complicated and it requires the most diplomacy. I see nothing yet that signals that conversation can begin. In fact, I see signs in the opposite direction, which is not great for Syria. It is disintegrating before our eyes, and it gets harder day by day to have that conversation.
Okay, thank you. We're having trouble hearing people being heard in the back. Shlomo, it seems to me that from an Israeli perspective, when you look at Iran is not doing that well. Its main ally, Syria, is crumbling. It's Bashar Assad may lose power if he admits himself that things are not going well. So in a way, Iranian position in the region is actually weakening. Is that a factor in the thinking in Israel, or this is so focused on the weapon that all other considerations are completely irrelevant?
Well, I don't know whether it is a factor or not, because I am not privy to the internal discussions, of course, and I didn't hear from the Israeli leaders any assertions on this subject. I think that you are right. I think that Iran is only weakening in contradiction to the common wisdom. It is weakening because it's overextended. It is weakening because it lost its soft power. Iran, before the so-called Arab Spring, was very popular in the Arab-Sunni street. Now, it's not so much because of obvious reasons. Its major client, Syria, is in decline, and it seems that at least on the little bit longest run is doomed. So that is one of the reasons that I think that when Israelis are arguing that the agreement is bad because it is going to make the troublesome behavior of Iran even more troublesome, I'm not so much convinced that these arguments are really sincere.
Okay. Thank you. Fahad, are the Saudis more worried about the fact that with the deal, Iran is suddenly becoming less of a pariah, more of a legitimate state, and therefore more of an actor that will, as Deb said, will be sitting at the table than the actual details of the nuclear agreement? That the nuclear agreement is not really relevant. It's just the perception of Iran in the world that is that Iran is coming out of the shadows for the first time.
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think the Saudis, certainly many Saudis, maybe not everybody, but again, prominent ex-officials as well as journalists and writers have expressed their fears very openly that this deal will actually embolden Iran, and that now that it, possibly has the blessing of the U.S. and the European powers, that it will use the billions of dollars of unfrozen assets, and that now that the sanctions have been removed, that money will, in the views of many, will not go towards rebuilding its infrastructure or addressing economic challenges, but that possibly billions of dollars will indeed go towards further supporting militant proxies in Yemen, Lebanon, and other places, and most importantly in Syria. I think, as Deb said, Syria is a real sticking point, I think, in the going forward. I think Saudi Arabia has invested tremendous political capital into Syria. Unlike other countries, certainly in the West, I don't think the Saudis foresee a scenario where they simply turn a new page with Bashar al-Assad. I think I'm very confident in saying that I cannot think of another person who is probably more universally reviled at this point by Saudis than Bashar al-Assad. And I think Saudis have blamed him to a great extent for allowing ISIS to construct a jihadi narrative that seems to have unfortunately resonated with Muslim youths around the world, not just in the region, which helps explain why some 20,000 foreign fighters are in Syria, which is an even bigger number than was the case in the 80s with Afghanistan.
Thank you. And we will take questions from the audience. Please identify yourself, and there are microphones. And yes.
I'm Randall Doyle. I teach at Georgetown University. Just two quick questions. Two of the biggest points that seem to be over and over again in the media. One is the verification process, and fundamentally, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, are they pretty much satisfied with what they think is a credible verification thing? And the second argument is, and Secretary Kerry talks about this all the time, that the fundamental paths toward making a bomb have been blocked, at least for the short term, for the next 10, 15 years. Is that credible throughout the Middle East? Because it seems to be the two biggest problems, the verification and blocking the paths of any kind of real development of a nuclear weapon. Is that basically accepted, though, within the Gulf states, despite various other disagreements? But are those two subjects basically accepted within this agreement?
Well, I mean, the official position of the Saudi foreign minister is that the deal does address those concerns. He made that statement very recently, but like I said in my remarks, again, the prevailing sentiment among Saudis is that they still have major doubts about the real intentions of Iran. I think that the Saudis have a very difficult time disconnecting Iran's actions in the region from the nuclear file. That many, a number of people on the panel have already mentioned this. They see the two issues as connected. In some ways, the U.S. and other European countries looked at the nuclear issue as a long-term problem. But again, for Saudis and perhaps other countries in the region, they're looking at the here and now. They're looking at Iran's behavior really over the past 30 years, but especially at this moment, which is arguably the most difficult moment in the region's history. And again, I know the Saudis look at what Iran is doing in Syria, even in Iraq, Lebanon, and now Yemen, and they have trouble trusting its intentions. You know, in some ways, I think in the views of many Saudis, Iran, you know, kind of talks a good deal, but its actions say something very differently. So I think there's still a trust issue, and I have no doubt that the Saudis will be watching going forward, that making sure that Iran sticks very closely to the terms of the agreement, that the verification process is made public, and that you know, during the next few decades, that the inspection regime is very transparent, and that it reassures the Saudis and others that Iran is indeed sticking to the terms of the agreement.
Muath?
Well, I mean, Fahad covered it pretty comprehensively. The one thing I want to add is that, you know, I think the Emiratis in particular, the Gulf states, they trust that the Obama administration wants to make sure that Iran doesn't get a bomb in the next 15 years. They have no reason to doubt President Obama's commitment to that. And if you read Jeffrey Goldberg's interview with President Obama, in which he said, you know, I know that it's my legacy on the line. 20 years from now, you know, the president says he's going to be around, and his legacy will be measured against the success or failure of the deal. And I think, you know, a lot of people in the Gulf trust in that. The issue is, does Iran cheat? The issue is what happens if Iran cheats. The issue is obviously what we talked about, you know, all the regional, someone called them disturbances, the regional disturbances. But I think on that question, the verification, the compliance, I think they trust that the P5+1, obviously including the United States, are committed to ensuring that Iran doesn't get a bomb. And there's no reason for them to doubt that commitment. And so, yeah, I think they believe that if you know, implemented, it would, at least for the next 15 years, ensure that Iran doesn't get a bomb or breakout capability.
Jane?
This panel is exceptional. And thank you, Henri, and thank you to all of you. I was interested, and I guess I agree with Shlomo's comments, that there's a disconnect in Israel between the political leadership, which has just seen that an election, which was expected to be close, was won on the basis of the security argument, and the military leadership, or the former military leadership, which sees this Iranian threat differently. But my question is about kids in the region. There's a youth bulge in every country, and the people in the political leadership in every country don't include, in most cases, or I can't think of an instance in which they do, people who are under 25, which is the overwhelming majority of the population in every country. So my question is, how do youth in these countries view the Iran deal, if they even think about it?
You're closer to that generation than I am, so please go ahead.
You know, I don't think they spend too much time thinking about it.
That's right. I think
the short end of
I think the Iranians do more.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's been some polls on Iranian youth, which is the majority of the country born after the revolution, who are hugely in favor and see this as a life-changing moment for them.
I mean, understandably, right?
Because it will be.
I will say this. I think that, and that remains to be the case, but the Saudi campaign in Yemen has received overwhelming support from the Saudi population, including youths. I think they see it as they saw many Saudis see Yemen as a defining moment, as a place to check Iranian encroachment in the region, and obviously, you know, due to its proximity and its very close ties to various political players in Yemen, Saudi Arabia invariably becomes involved in all of Yemen's various troubles over the years. But, you know, it's one thing for Iran to be supporting the Bashar al-Assad. in Syria and to continue to support Hezbollah in Lebanon and Shia militias in Iraq. But Yemen, and I hesitate to use this term here, is a red line for Saudi Arabia. And I think they made a fairly dramatic statement that in many ways was out of character with their foreign policy for many years.
Shlomo, you want to add anything about Israeli youth?
Yeah, in Israel, I don't think the youth are really different than the general population. If they are a little bit more nationalistic because youngsters tend to be more extreme in everything, at least in Israel.
Yes.
Hi, Toba Hellerstein, Mina's Associates. I think it's been pretty clear throughout the negotiations ever since it was, E3, that the regional activism of Iran was really beyond the scope, that it was really, siloed out to be nuclear issues, and then regional issues in, Iraq and Yemen and, less Yemen, but more Syria. These were sort of Chinese walled out. What I'm curious about is, given that fact on the part of P5 at this point, and given the fact that Iran has really been the most successful actor within the conflict in Iraq, supporting the Shia paramilitary groups, clearly significantly more potent than Sunni tribal leaders, and obviously the Iraqi military. This is a little bit more of a question for Shlomo, actually. What would be, in your opinion, the Israeli perspective to increased Iranian interaction and legitimacy within the security paradigm within Iraq, and perhaps possibly being brought more to the table in the eyes of Europe and the US? What would be, if they are effective, if they are more effective in combating ISIL than traditional security groups, what would be the Israeli perspective on that?
Well, the Israeli perception is different than the US one. That is one of the reasons for the tension and the conflict. Israelis don't perceive ISIL as the main threat. For them, Iran and its collaborators, whether they are Shiite or Sunnis or other, are the main threat. And because of that, Israel will support more involvement of Iran if Iran will pay the entry fee. And the entry fee is to change its behavior vis-à-vis Israel. Its support for movements and organizations that attack Israel.
Marina.
Thank you. It seems to me that there is somewhat of a disconnect in the perception of the very aggressive Iranian behavior in the neighborhood, in the region, and the fact that the Iranians did make some concessions in negotiating the nuclear deal. In other words, what I hear is, on one hand, yes, Iran, there are doubts about the compliance and so on, but Iran did make some compromises in negotiating the nuclear deal. But at the same time, and that means essentially, implicitly, that that there is a more reasonable, less extremist group that is wielding power right now in the country. But yet, when it comes to the perception of how Iran is going to behave in the region, then the assumption seems to be that it's the hardliners that are still in control. And that's where I see a disconnect. On one hand, Iran has been willing to compromise on the nuclear deal, but no, Iran will continue exactly doing the same, with the same radical policies that it had pursued before in the region.
What I see in the region and the way that Iran behaves is you have a balance of weakness almost everywhere. You have states that were hollowed out, and it only was revealed after the Arab Spring. And so states collapsed. They don't exactly look like it, but they have collapsed. There are no state structures in many countries now in the Middle East. Iran is pursuing its interests, which is not a hardline, softline pursuit, but it is widespread agreement, for example, in Iraq. We will never allow a government like Saddam Hussein again, or a Ba'athist regime again, that can put us through what we went through with the Iran-Iraq War and the Poison Chalice in 1988. That is not a hardline position. That is an Iranian position. And so when you watch some of the things that they do in Iran, it makes perfect sense in their self-interest and their security interest. Syria is the same. And so what you begin to see them doing now is looking at an arc that is their interest, from Basra to Baghdad, from Baghdad to Damascus, from Damascus to the coast, and that may be it for them. I mean, I think we kind of have to see in the next year if that's where their core interests are. But I think their foreign policy in the region is not necessarily hardline, softline. It is in their interest.
If I may.
Yeah.
The nature of the Iranian regime is such that, of course, it's not a one-man regime, as some people argue, but still the most powerful political actor is the religious leader, Mr. Khamenei. And we have to listen to Mr. Khamenei. And when you listen to what he is saying since the agreement was concluded, that is exactly what he is saying. We are still in conflict with the West. We are not going to change our behavior. So of course, sometimes there is a difference between saying and doing, and we'll have to see, but we have good reasons to believe that that is the case. On top of what we already heard. And one small comment. You know, the Iranians don't perceive themselves as the aggressors. They perceive themselves as protecting their national interests. And they perceive the other party, whether it is the United States or Israel, as the aggressor.
Yeah, I kind of alluded to this in my opening remarks. I think there are certainly Saudis, there's disagreement among Saudis as to how to read the Iran deal, and that was certainly the case in the first day or so after the deal was announced. In fact, on the 14th, I spent at least a couple of hours just on Twitter trying to gauge Saudi reaction to the deal, and I was struck at how almost diametrically opposed Saudis, some Saudis were in terms of what to make of the deal. Some saw it as Iran getting its way, whereas others have used the word capitulation. I've seen that a number of times to describe what Iran has, what has happened, and they see Iran as basically succumbing to international pressure, and that the sanctions have borne fruit. So, that's where things are, at this point. But like I said, going forward, I think the Saudis now realize that this is a done deal. And I think, again, if you look at their behavior in terms of their diplomatic outreach over the past few months, not to mention the some $80 billion that they've already committed towards nuclear energy, a nuclear energy program to meet its ever-increasing domestic energy needs. I think the Saudis just assumed that this deal was a done deal and treated it as an eventuality. They did not want to wait until the last second. They embarked on this diplomatic offensive, and they're looking into nuclear energy again. And I think they do have a legitimate reason in the sense that per capita, Saudis are among the highest consumers of water and electricity in the world. So they, and again, I think it was the UK, the ambassador to the UK, Prince Mohammed bin Nawaf, who again penned an opinion piece where he said fairly directly that Saudi Arabia will not stand by idly, and that it's watching Iran's behavior, that it's looking at these negotiations closely, and that it will make the necessary adjustments and react and adjust to new realities in the region.
Muath, you want to say something?
So just really briefly, I mean, I think to a lot of people in the region, there are two Irans. There's the Iran of Mr. Rouhani and Zarif that negotiates in Vienna and New York. And there's the Iran of Khamenei and Qasem Soleimani. It's not Rouhani who pops up in Dahiya, in Beirut, or in Syria to follow or sort of manage military operations there. It's Qasem Soleimani. And I don't think there is any indication. I mean, the idea that they're expecting that Iran is going to continue on its regional policy and it's not going to compromise is based on the fact that while Iran was compromising on the nuclear program, it upped its regional interventions. They don't have any signal. A few days after the deal, Khamenei came out and said, we stand by the oppressed people of Bahrain. I mean, the message that sends to the Gulfies isn't exactly a very pleasant one. It doesn't give them any hope that there's going to be a reconciliation between the Iran of Rouhani and the Iran of Khamenei.
If I could just address one thing that Muath said. There's so many myths almost about Soleimani at this point in the Arab media that I sincerely believe that the character, the most interesting man in the world, the advertising campaign is based on him. That's just me, but I think there might be something to that.
This gentleman here.
My question is Iran.
Identify yourself, please.
How is the treaty and its consequences viewed within Iran, and what's the range of opinions?
Deb, you want to-
Boy, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. I don't know.
It's part of the problem.
Well, you have a panel without an Iranian expert on the
so
panel.
we're looking at regional conflict. Yes, sir.
I'm Skip Isaacs. I'm an independent writer, curious onlooker. It's been mentioned sort of glancingly here, the issue of all this money that Iran is going to get if the sanctions are lifted, and the fear that that would be used to support actions that are threatening and dangerous to the neighbors and the rest of the world. How valid does the panel, anybody in the panel, think that that argument is, one? And two, am I wrong in that argument sounding to me like an argument that sanctions should be eternal, that there should never be any kind of arrangement whereby those sanctions are ended?
Well, I don't know that anyone is advocating that, but I think at least one high-ranking UN official estimates that, before the lifting of the sanctions, that Iran was providing Bashar al-Assad with as much as $6 billion a year to help sustain his onslaught against, the people of Syria. So I think that's certainly a legitimate concern for countries in the region, that before sanctions are lifted, Iran was allocating that much money. Does it make sense that after the removal of sanctions that it would suddenly stop its support of Assad and militant groups in the region? Common sense says no.
Go ahead.
Well, as was said, it's a legitimate concern. But adding these proxies was always a very high priority issue for Iran's. So the fact of the matter is that even when Iran was in a very bad financial situation, and I'm not sure that that was mostly because of the sanctions. That was, for example, because much of it was because of the reduction in the price of oil. Much of it was because of corruption and inefficient economic system. they found the $6 billion to give to Syria, and hundreds of millions of dollars that were needed for Hezbollah. So certainly it will be easier for them to do that after the sanctions will be removed. But here I must say that I read this morning something very interesting. I read the Washington Institute report exactly on this subject. And there was a piece of information there that I was not aware of. And they said that the Department of Treasury here in the United States that is following Iran's expenditure on its proxies reached the conclusion that in the last 18 months there was a discernible reduction in Iran's support to Hezbollah. That's interesting, because most of this period, the interim agreement was in power, and more than $15 billion of sanctions money were released to Iran. And it was not used to give more money to Hezbollah, at least. And that is, I think, an indication that the real economic needs, the needs of the huge population of Iran, it's an 80 million population state, are such that I am certain that most of this money will go to this direction. But as I said, it will be easier to finance also the other things.
Just one short thing. Iran actually has to pay some attention to public opinion. And Iranians ask the question, you're giving all this money to, and tick off the boxes, and people actually do have to answer to that. Rouhani knows that and talks about it quite a lot. There's also a Majlis election that's coming up this year. And that, just like all elections, it's the moment when you have to give your constituency something. And so I think that the Iranians know very well they cannot be seen spending tons of money outside the country. And it's very interesting that we actually have a bit of data to support that.
I have a number of questions. So let me take two questions, Amal and this gentleman here, because we're running out of time. First, we'll start with that and we'll go to...
Donald Meyer is former partner at Morgan Lewis. One of the objections to the agreement is that it would allow a pathway to a bomb and therefore encourage other countries in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, to also seek a bomb. Others have argued that the practical matter, Iran is already a nuclear weapon, a nuclear power, and therefore it shifted the balance of power in the Middle East already. I'd like the panel's thoughts about the likelihood of other countries in the Middle East, for a variety of reasons, looking to attain nuclear weapons themselves.
Can you pass to Amal, to that lady over there?
Thank you. My name is Amal Mudallali. I'm with the Wilson Center. I have a question about something Deb talked about, and I would like to see if everybody can give us his opinion about it. You were talking about this changing of calculus in Washington. Could you please elaborate more on that? And the question is there really a sense that Washington, the thinking of Washington, strategic thinking of Washington, is moving towards Iran as the most important country for them in the region? It's a more viable state, as you hear in this town now. I heard from other people that Iran is our natural ally. Is this something that you sense, that is thinking in Washington, that Iran is a better or more viable ally in the region than the Gulf countries? And is this a fear in the Gulf that people have? Thank you.
Thanks. Let's start with the first question about the likelihood of other countries going nuclear.
Well, officially, the Saudi foreign minister has been asked this question on a number of occasions, and he naturally did not answer it either way. And that's, I think, to be expected. However, I think
it's called nuclear ambiguity.
That's a good way to characterize it. However, other former officials have again, not directly said that Saudi Arabia might consider it, but as I mentioned, I guess it was during the Q&A, that Saudi Arabia is investing as much as $80 billion in nuclear energy research, again, for peaceful purposes to address its domestic energy needs. And if I could just answer Amal's question, just because it is a claim that is being made by several, not just supporters of the Iran deal, but different quarters here in the U.S., that Iran is this natural ally and that it's only a matter of time before it supplants Saudi Arabia as the U.S.'s strongest or closest ally in the region. And I addressed this a couple of weeks ago in an article that I wrote, and I think it's very unlikely, and there's several reasons for that. For one thing, now I do want to make it clear that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. are perhaps not the most natural of allies, yet they've been able to maintain a mutually beneficial relationship for decades, 7 decades at this point. Saudi Arabia, I think, realizes that in terms of the security guarantees that the United States provides it, there is no single alternative in terms of a single country that can offer that to them, or a combination of countries, to be honest. Saudi Arabia continues to be the biggest purchaser of U.S. weapons. The two countries obviously cooperate very closely in terms of security issues. Their troops have fought alongside each other back in 1990 in the Gulf War, and they're doing so again against ISIS in Syria specifically. There's also an estimated 70,000 Saudi students who are studying in the United States currently. So I think there's enough there to sustain Saudi-U.S. relations for a very long time. On the flip side of that, if you look at, again, the past since the Iranian Revolution, in terms of Iran-U.S. dealings, unfortunately, it's that for the most part, and that appears to be the case still, the Iranian government, as a matter of policy, has targeted Americans in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Saudi Arabia, in essentially terrorist operations, and that have killed hundreds of Americans now, whether, as some on the panel have already said, whether the political leadership there is willing to change that policy, and I think it has to be a dramatic change, remains to be seen. I think that the Ayatollah's comments last week are probably not very reassuring I don't think they should be very reassuring to the U.S., to be honest. I'm pretty sure they're not very reassuring to people in the region as well. So again, I think Iran, if it wants to supplant Saudi Arabia, it has a long way to go, and again, its actions eventually will speak much louder than words.
Well, if you want to take, you can do either question.
Well, I mean, I agree with that.
Okay.
on the idea of this, yes, I mean, I've heard it too, this notion that Iran is a more natural ally to the United States. I think sometimes someone just says something that sounds provocative, and then it just becomes part of the conventional wisdom as some sort of gem of insight. Fact of the matter is, the Gulf states, including the UAE, have not only fought in Kuwait with the United States, there are Emirati troops in Afghanistan. And that this relationship, by the way, the Iranian nuclear program as an issue that animates the alliance between the Gulf and the United States, has existed for about 15 years. The relationship existed long before that. It's about terrorism, it's about common interests, it's about energy supplies. There's a whole host of regional files on which the UAE and its Gulf allies agree. I don't think you can make the same argument about Iran, not for a really long time. Perhaps. Iran was once pro-American. Maybe one day it will become too, but not anytime soon, I don't think.
Deb?
I'll just say quickly, there's been a lot of writing in the Gulf about, is America a Sunni power or a Shia power? We aren't. And we are a power, like all powers, that pursue its interests. I think from the Gulf perspective, what they see is the giant is out of jail. and its parole officer has a long-term relationship that is now codified in this agreement. America and Iran will be talking together for quite a long time, and all of that is set out.
As parole officers regularly do, right?
As parole officers regularly do. And so there's a natural tendency to think, gosh, if they're going to be talking that much, of course a relationship may build. And I think now almost all opinions are simply emotional. We don't know. We are at the very beginning of a long, long process. So you're right about conventional wisdom, that something sticks, and then people talk about that for a while. It's one of those questions you can't really answer yet. We are at the very, very beginning.
Shlomo, you want to talk about
the concern of further proliferation in the Middle East is a legitimate one. And actually, to some extent, it already started before these negotiations, because different states in the Middle East were talking and taking initial steps on starting their own nuclear program. Civilian. But you know that civilian can always be a starting point and a coverage for a later military program. So that is already the situation. What I fail to understand is why this agreement that takes Iran backwards will increase the risk and not diminish it a little bit. That is one comment. And the other comment is, well, I think that to some extent many elements of this agreement can be a good example. I would like other steps in the Middle East that start their nuclear program to have the same monitoring arrangement, such intrusive monitoring arrangement. This is not the nature of the present safeguards agreement that the IAEA has with these states.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And
Very nice.
My pleasure.
let me give you my card. Okay. Oh.